Juwaluan, thank you so much for that welcoming reception. I really appreciate it. I hear my bio read, it makes me, feel a little cringish at time, because I'm really just a guy from Meetinghouse. I'm born and raised in Indian Township, and I still think of myself that way. I go home and back a lot to make sure that I always stay in connection with my community, that my children have connection with community, amongst other things. And so I'm always here, even though I live in Mashantucket, Connecticut these days, I'm always back here in the state of Maine. So thank you so much for that wonderful reception. And I hope you get something out of tonight's talk. So, I'm born and raised Passamaquoddy from the community of Meetinghouse. And Eric, I appreciate you, even though you stumbled with the words, right? I really appreciate you using our language. One of the things I always tell people in this world of education is that our kids on the reservation have to learn English words like onomatopoeia by the time they're in fourth grade. It's only fair that English speakers learn a few of our words, especially if you're going to live in Wabanaki territories. Tonight is a little bit kind of a broad view of the work that I do. I get a lot of different labels because of all of this kind of wide variety of work that I do. I wrote a book, and so therefore people call me an author. I work with film. Sometimes people call me a filmmaker, but really I am just an educator. And where this all emanates from is, from my father, Wayne Newell. And that might be a familiar name to some people because he did quite a lot for the state of Maine, going all the way back to the 60s, did things like served on the National Advisory Council of Indian Education, which you have to be appointed by the President of the United States to be on. He was appointed twice, first by President Carter back in the 70s, and then again by President Obama in 2012. So, when it comes to my education, I only have a bachelor's degree. Yet I work at the University of Connecticut. I am the Native American Cultural Program Director, and I also teach at the University of Connecticut. The University of Connecticut has come a long way in very recent years, much like Maine, which kind of has led the way in a lot of ways in recognizing traditional knowledge on par with the PhDs that they have there. Because what I tell people is, you hear about me with the Mystic River Singers. That time in my life was really spent traveling all over Indian country. When I say Indian country, I mean where, places where Native people gather. Could be reservations, it could be just, localities, within a city where the Native people live. But I got to travel all over the US and Canada and spend time in Native communities. And what I would do is I would pay attention. I would sit there and be quiet and pay attention to what those people, the elders, the MCs at the powwows, you name it, the educators of their communities would tell me, an outsider. Because that's one of the things to understand, is that Native people are not a monolith. Our cultures are so widely different from one another. And so therefore I had a lot to learn in these spaces. And so I sat there and I paid attention to these elders and listened of how they taught someone like me, an outsider. Even though I'm Native, I'm still an outsider to these communities, about themselves. And I incorporated that into my own pedagogy. And so when, Mystic River, when it came time to move on from that, I went back into the world of education. I finished my degree at UConn. Originally went to Dartmouth College, but did not finish there. So I finished a Bachelor of General Studies at the University of Connecticut, and in 2018 founded something called Akomawt Educational Initiative. So Akomawt Educational Initiative is a partnership. It's three of us. And what it is, the word Akomawt comes from the Passamaquoddy language, and it translates to the snowshoe path. And that is the symbol that drives the mission of the work that we do. We are a partnership, educational consultancy that works in all areas of education, whether K through 12 schools, like I was doing today here at the Mass Landing School, working with teachers in professional developments, working with colleges, universities, as well as working with the system of education. One of our clients is actually the National Park Service, of all places. And if you think about it, this might be something you hadn't considered before, but the National Park Service is the single largest educational institution we have in this country. They control the education of over 2,000 sites and tell the history of this country in those sites. And what they tell is very trusted by us as citizens of this country. And so therefore, to work with the National Park Service at doing things like telling the history of indigenous genocides within national park spaces to go along with the histories that have been taught all along and really broaden people's perspective and minds about how those spaces became those spaces, is really a great piece of work that we're doing here. And we're lucky to have Secretary Haaland, the very first Native Secretary of the Interior, in that position, and also the head of the National Park Service, Kevin Sams, is also a Native. And so we're at a really interesting time in history, a historic time, in fact, where these sites are actively being controlled by Native people, and with the want of telling a more fuller history, because we are still here. That's one of the things to remember, is one of the reasons I wrote If You Live During the Plymouth Thanksgiving is because of the erasure that the Mayflower narrative has done to the Wampanoag people, to the point that today's Wampanoag people, oftentimes when they meet somebody that is non-native, they are usually surprised to meet them. We thought that you were all dead, because the Mayflower narrative always talks about them only in the past tense. And that fed an implicit bias that started in kindergarten and has been with them their entire life. And so the first time they meet a Wampanoag person, sometimes they're a little bit surprised. Same thing would happen when I live in the Pequot community of Mashantucket. And when I taught at the Pequot Museum, it was not uncommon for people raised in the state of Connecticut. I mean, we're actually here in Maine, you're a little bit blessed in a way that Wabanaki people are so active in the education system and so present, within the state, that you do have a sense of who the people are. But Massachusetts and Connecticut, they love their colonial history. They have erased Native people out of the story altogether. And so when people meet a Pequot, like my children, who are enrolled at the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, once again, because they only heard about the Pequot massacre in the public school system, they think that Pequots are all dead and gone. And it was not uncommon on a tour for a child or even their parent to raise their hand just innocently, because they had been wondering this during the tour. Can I ask a question? Are the Pequots still alive? Right? So that's, when we're talking about the erasure of Native peoples and this work, it really is far-reaching. It has to be, because the American public education system has done a really horrible job of teaching about Native peoples and has been active in the erasure of Native peoples from the public school system. So this is a quick picture here of my partners. And Donna Spears is the lady on the right side, I believe no, it's on your left side, sorry. I'm making sure I get my alignment right here. She is Dene, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Ojibwe. So she's a mixture of 4 different tribes, full-blooded Native, but a mixture of 4 different tribes. She was raised on the Navajo reservation, so she primarily identifies as Dene and speaks the Navajo language. And our other partner, Dr. Jason Mancini, who is a non-Native. So we're a majority Native-owned Native consultancy, but we are not all Native people. And one thing I tell people about this work is that we need allies. Because it wasn't Native people that drove us into the ditch when it comes to learning about Native people. So we should not have the burden of shouldering all the responsibility of fixing it. We really need allies. Those of you in this room right here that are just here present to listen today are part of that allyship. So I want to thank you for being here tonight. It really means something to me to see this robust crowd here for this talk. So how do we indigenize and history and education. And so where that comes from for me is we've been hearing this word decolonization a lot, right? And we apply it to things like education, history, and museums. And there is a problem with that because we don't have a really good definition of what that is. If you look it up, the different scholars that use that have kind of their own definitions of what that is. And so people are a little confused sometimes about it. And especially in the world of museums. What I tell museum people is when I go to their museum is that if you are working on decolonizing your museum, well, you will never fully decolonize it because museums are inherently colonial. Native people do not preserve history the way museums and collecting institutions do. And so therefore, your museum is always going to be colonial. So decolonizing it fully should not be your goal. But it's a process at looking at the way the museum world, the American conservation movement, has been part of the erasure, has been part of the collecting of Native items and storing them away out of the hands of Native people who could relearn their histories and education. We'll talk about that in a little bit from those collections and things like that. So. The museum world has, been part of the problem, but can also be part of the solution. And so that's where we at Akomawt kind of took on the term of indigenizing education. Because if you decolonize something, remove a harmful process, and one harmful process is keeping human body remains of our ancestors within museum walls. Not all museums do that, but there are definitely those that do that. Changing that system, so recognizing the harm that it's caused and doing something better going forward. So, following NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, and repatriating those human remains. When we just got some Wabanaki remains within the last few years that have been held at the Harvard Peabody Museum since around the 1890s, some of them being children, and so they are finally put back to rest. And so that's part of the important part of what decolonizing a museum can be. But when it comes to indigenizing, that is where the real fun stuff comes in. Because what that means is we are going to take Native perspectives and we're going to center them within their own stories. Rather than it being an outsider telling an interpretation of our history or our culture or our language, we as Wabanaki people are going to tell it ourselves. And one of the places that happens here in the state of Maine is the Abbey Museum. The Abbey Museum didn't always do it right. I'll give you that. And my predecessor before I became executive director was Cinnamon Catlin Legutko, and she started a process of decolonizing that museum. She actually bought the book Decolonizing Museums by Amy Lone Tree, who's a Ho-Chunk author, and she handed it out to all the board of trustees. And they started the work of updating that museum. So rather than just showcasing Native American, right, and that's a very general term that covers 574 tribes. So like anything that was Native American, from any tribe used to be exhibited in that museum. But it's supposed to be about Wabanaki peoples. That's what Robert Abbey founded it for. And so when we worked at that, Cinnamon realized that the museum was not telling the history of Wabanaki peoples correctly. And so she was able to get a grant, and they stripped down the entire main museum in Bar Harbor, in downtown Bar Harbor, and they rebuilt it up with Native people telling the narratives and the stories in there. And this map that you see here is a map of Chaquabannock-Gig, the land of the dawn. Okay, so if you look at this map, you might recognize now that we're looking at Maine and part of Canada, as well as Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, but there are no of those colonial borders established on this map. And it's an interesting way to look at our homeland here that we all enjoy these days. really shows how Native people were able to navigate this territory, for thousands of years. Gaspé, which is known as the Gaspé Peninsula, which, the French mispronunciation of that. There were journeys from all the way from Gaspé all the way down through Connecticut, which is the river, not the colony and then the state. But the river is Connecticut. Connecticut in the Passamaquoddy language means something long and straight. And they say Quinatucket down in the southern tribes. They would go all the way down there to the Long Island Sound area to trade for things like wampum. Which wampum we used in our territory as Wabanaki people, to make laws, to preserve our histories. We had wampum readers that had very special skills. And the last wampum reader that the Passamaquoddies had was a man named Sapiel Selmore. And so his knowledge unfortunately died with him, but we still have some of the records that were kept as a result. And so we know how the Wabanaki Confederacy operated because we can read it on the wampum belts that were left behind. Yet, up here in, where we live, in Passamaquoddy people at Skudig or the St. Croix River, we don't have the natural resources to create wampum. The quahog clam doesn't exist up there. And so we had to travel great distances in order to, get the raw materials to make these things. And that was one of the ways that we kept peace through this territory. Now, another thing that would happen is that in Wabanaki territory, a lot of times you hear, I'm going to, kind of disparage a myth a little bit. A lot of times you hear about Native people before colonization that they always fought with one another. Right. And I'm not saying that it was a perfect world, and there were, minor disputes that happened. But one of the things that happened is there was no major massacres or battles. There's literally only one pre-Columbian site in this continent, in North America, that shows a site of a major massacre, and that's all the way out west, the Crow Creek Massacre. And and large battles, leave a lot of archaeological evidence. You go to Europe, you're going to find tons of it. It's all over the place. There's been a lot of wars there. But here on the American continent, we don't have that. And why? Well, there was ways of diplomacy that existed within this territory here. Even though we were all vastly different cultures, we speak related languages to one another enough that we could understand and trade with one another. And one of the things that would happen is, even in our leadership, it was a very unique way of choosing leadership traditionally. So one of the things that would happen is if a leader died in my community, in the Passamaquoddy community, we would go through a year of mourning. And there were sub-chiefs, which were known as captains by the, that's the name that they were given, captain, which comes from captains, which were leaders of families, who would basically take over the leadership of the community for that year. And after that year of mourning, what would happen is we would send in people out to invite all the other Wabanaki chiefs that surrounded, starting with the Penobscot and then going east from there. And the purpose of their arrival at our community, their leadership arriving at our community, was to choose our next chief. So if you think about it, that's a very smart way of keeping peace over a very large geographic area. And that was the way of things. We didn't do things by vote or democracy. We did things by consensus. And we also, the chief that was chosen by everybody agreeing on it. And so one of the things that would happen, I'm going to do a little singing for you here in just a second. One of the things that would happen is we had protocols for how to do diplomacy, and music was actually a part of it. And I was lucky enough to grow up with somebody, Wayne Newell, who is was somebody that worked on preserving Passamaquoddy music. And he's the one that taught me this history. And so what would happen is when the arriving chiefs would come, they would have a delegation with them. They would arrive by canoe. And before they were welcomed onto the land from the water, they would be officially welcomed with a song, a welcome song. And so the purpose of the song was essentially to set the energy, that let them know that they were going to be welcome. And after they came onto the landscape, one of the things that would happen is the women in the community would actually steal their paddles and hide them, with the idea of making them feel so welcome that they would stay longer than they originally intended. So this is an example of one of those welcome songs. We have multiple examples. The one that we sing most often in our community is actually one that was composed by a woman named Blanche Sakabason, but this is an older one that was taught to my father by a woman named Eva Toma, an elder of my father's time when he was young. So what I tell people is that, but this particular rendition of a Passamaquoddy welcome song is really been at least 150 years in existence, and it may be longer than that. So this would be the type of song that they would sing to them. It would not be a dance song. It would be a song sung for them to stand up in their canoes regally and accept the welcoming that they were being given. Oh ya ne, oh ya ne, oh ya ne. Oh ya ne, oh ya ne, oh ya ne. Aguanode, 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 aguanode. Oh ya ne, oh ya ne, oh ya ne. Oh ya ne, oh ya ne, oh ya ne. Tahoe. So that's a little bit about some of the work that I do in Wabanaki territory, right, is really bringing those histories out. And you see how interesting they are, right? I feel like this country is so much more interesting when Native peoples are included, even though some of those histories are kind of hard. And when I talk about those histories being hard, I talk about indigenous genocides. That's part of the American history. But the purpose of teaching them is not to point fingers and say, you did wrong, you don't, because none of us were there that did these things, right? But we as human beings, all of us are Bamausawinomuk, we're all human beings, okay? And so all of us have a collective responsibility to the future. Okay, and so one of the things that we can do to build a better future is to look at where we as human beings screwed up and say it out loud. That's a mistake. And learn from it so that we can make a better future for the next generations that come after us. So that intergenerational thinking is built into the way I think about education. My father always knew that he was never going to live to see the intended outcome of all his language work and all his education work. That didn't mean he wouldn't do the work, because he knew that the next generation would pick it up. And luckily, the next generation happened to be in his own family. And that's the work that I'm doing these days. So I'm going to go over these next slides kind of quickly because I want to have time to get to the film and also have some Q&A with you all. But when it comes to the work that we at Akomawt do and myself, I get to go to fun places like the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, which is one of our clients, a museum that wants to do better, but is actually very old-fashioned in the way that they do things. And one of the things that they do is they allow me to come into their gallery, their North American Indian Gallery, which is located in the basement of the museum. And you can see what I'm starting to do. They allow me to criticize the hell out of it. Because they do things in a very old-fashioned way. If you go into that gallery, it's going to showcase a lot of Plains art and Southwest art. That's an element of the American conservation movement. When they began, they wanted to collect from tribes who they felt were authentic. And East Coast tribes were much more impacted by colonization, and so therefore were not collected from. And so if you go into very old museums like this, you're going to see a whole lot of Plains artwork. You're going to see a whole lot of Southwest pottery. But what is missing from this gallery? Wampum. There's no wampum in there to talk about the Northeast. There's no ash flint basketry, right? You guys are in Maine. You all know about ash flint basketry here, right? And that's, a Wabanaki fine art, and there is none at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And so I get to go in there and call them out on it. Now, turning the MFA is kind of like turning a cruise ship. You really have to keep, the pressure on the wheel, and it takes a really long time. So they are not where they need to be, but they do have people in the museum that are looking to make a better future for it. Now, the project that was talked about in the intro, I worked on, and my fellow Akomawt partners also worked on at the Leventhal Map Center. One of the things we were doing with that particular project is they were already curating this one. They had been curating it up for 3 years. And it was the telling of American westward expansion through maps. Now, if you're going to tell that story through maps, you're going to tell a very one-sided story. And the Leventhal Map Center, which is located in the Boston Public Library, knew that they were telling a very one-sided story. And so therefore they came to us to help them, because they had been trying to incorporate Native viewpoints, but they were having trouble getting people to help them out. Now, Akomawt Educational Initiative was born in 2018, and so we were there the year before this exhibit was about to go on, and we came on and we reviewed 140 pages of text. And we did things like edit the text, where they would talk about the gradual expansion of the United States. Now, if your time clock started with European exploration, okay, 100 years might seem like a long, gradual process. But if your time clock, like me, starts with 12,000 years ago with the last ice age, then 100 years is like the snap of fingers. So we were crossing out gradual and writing in rapid. And by the way, everywhere else in the world teaches about American westward expansion as the most rapid expansion of a human population across a geography that size ever in the history of the world. Only in America do we fool ourselves that it was a gradual expansion. So one of the things that we did was we helped them with some inquiries, those three questions that you see at the bottom. And we also helped them get in touch with Native scholars. And one of the things that I did with them was I made a deal with them. I said, I'm going to go to these people, but guess what? They've been approached by museums before. They've had their words watered down, and all of these types of things. They're not going to buy in to helping you out unless they have sovereignty over their own words. So therefore, whatever they produce for you, you are not allowed to edit. Let it say what it needs to say. And what happened was we took these scholars and we allowed them to look at the maps and the captions, and they would pick one and they would react to it with a 100-word, what we ended up calling a viewpoint. So this is an example of that, right? This is from Dr. Margaret Pierce, an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, who says, alongside with the captions and everything else that are along with these maps, maps were both the mechanisms for and witnesses to the betrayals of justice that made the violence of dispossession and extermination possible. We can stand and witness too if we have the courage to look closely and listen. So that was very much counter to this story of American westward expansion, the Transcontinental Railroad, the establishment of cities. All of a sudden, we're talking about indigenous genocides, right? And those are being put into the exhibit itself. And you might be surprised. I went back to the Leventhal Map Center often, and they were very old school, and they keep a handwritten guest book. And if you look at the reactions to it, people were very appreciative of the fact that this exhibit did not lie to them or water down the history. So America is at a turning point here in a lot of ways that I think we're ready, to really, start to grapple with this. One of the things we also do is we create resources. So with the Leventhal Map Center, we created, what we call best practices when teaching about Native people. One of the things we go over is terminology, Native American, American Indian, Indian. That's actually the question we get asked the most often. Which one do I use? right? I don't know which one. I don't want to offend anybody. Please tell me. And what I tell people, after we explain the differences between them, we end up letting them down gently and telling them that, none of them are correct. So don't get too hung up on it, because I'm not Native American. I'm not American Indian. I'm not Indian. I am Passamaquoddy. That's my tribe and my culture. Yet I do live as part of a sovereign, the Passamaquoddy Nation. And so therefore, in this country, in the United States Constitution, they use the word Indian, and so that classifies a political status, a member of a sovereign within a sovereign. And so we're actually never going to get rid of that word Indian as long as the American government exists. So anytime they make a law, they use that word, the Indian Child Welfare Act, Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and so on and so forth, because that is the actual political status that Native people have. Dawnland, a project of 2018, and one of the things I'll just pull out one piece of some of the advice that I gave. When it came to creating the map, one of the things that I saw in the early drafts of the movie is that they were naming the communities sometimes with our language and sometimes with English. And I was like, you got to clean that up. And I was like, you know what? Let's put our language first. Once again, we want the English speakers to learn a little bit of our language so they can understand this land better. And so when they created the map of Maine and they mapped out the Native communities that exist in present day state of Maine, one of the things I encouraged was the use of our language in naming them. So Madokmiguk, you see where I come from there, Zibayig, those are the two Passamaquoddy communities. Medex that's actually Holton, the Holton Band of Maliseets, and that's named after the river, which you might know as Meduxanakeg, which is a mispronunciation of that. And so that refers to hard on the shoes. The portage that would go through there actually was very rough on rough stone. It would actually tear apart moccasins. And so that's what it's named after, is after that portage. So at the Abbey Museum, once again, just really quickly, I just want to show how a museum like the Abbey Museum, a colonial museum, can decolonize, work on that process, but can also indigenize their process and also be part of cultural repatriation. So in the Aroostook-Band of Mi'kmaq, which is now known as the Mi'kmaq Nation here in Canada, they were, that's a small community, a lot of Mi'kmaq people in Canada, but in the US we're down to, around 800 or so. And in that community, the art of quill work had gone down to the point where only one family was creating quill work. And so the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Jennifer Pictou, said, I want to do something about this. And the Abbey Museum has a tremendous collection of Mi'kmaq quill work. You see the very high level of art here. They made entire chair sets, placemats, the whole thing for the Victorian era, very well decorated. And the Abbey has these things. And so what happened was the Abbey Museum collections manager at the time decided to work with the TIPO, and instead of bringing them down to the museum and look in our collections, we took all of our collections that were Mi'kmaq quill work and we took them up to the community instead. And we allowed, through a workshop, we allowed the artists that wanted to learn these different quill work styles. There's 8 different stitches that they wanted to learn. They were able to handle these objects. They could pick them up. They could look at them. These are things that museums don't do. They don't allow you to pick up and handle stuff. Yet we were allowing them to do that so that they could learn. And as a result, we ended up creating an exhibit called Quillers of the Dawn, which really exhibited the learning process for the community members there, but also some of the new art that got created as a result. That's gorgeous, right? So museums can be absolutely part of the solution if they take on, these types of ways of thinking, that they center Native perspectives and also center Native people in the relearning of what is in the collections. And then, of course, I got to spend time with the children this morning at Mass Landing School talking about my book, If You Live, during the Plymouth Thanksgiving. Those starred reviews I just put there to give you an idea, how well received the book was and is to this day. It was released in 2021. it made the National Council of Social Studies Best of 2021, as well as the School Library Journal Best of 2021. It was endorsed by the National Indian Education Association, but most importantly, it was endorsed by the Wampanoag people. This is not my history, this is Wampanoag history, and so I wanted to be very careful with that. And my intention was to write a book that would incorporate Wampanoag perspectives and would get rid of that implicit bias. I'm surprised you're alive, right? We have a children's book now that spreads out from the Mayflower landing at 1620 and the feast in 1621, and talks about the great dying of 1616 to 1619 that happened before the Plymouth landed, that wiped out the village of Patuxet, and also talks about how we actually got the holiday that we have today. Because guess what? This history, that Thanksgiving, was forgotten about for 220 years until Mort's Relation was found in the 1800s and written about by a man named Alexander Young. And in a footnote, talking about a letter that Edward Winslow wrote about the feast, which was 3 sentences, called it the first Thanksgiving, because in the 1800s they were already having harvest feasts in America that they were calling Thanksgivings. But to the English in the 1600s, a day of Thanksgiving was a day of prayer and fasting. Right? So there's a story to how we got from one place to the other, and that's what's told within this book. And that leads us to our film here, which we're going to be loading up for you very shortly. I'll just load this up by saying Wet'suwet'en, The Approaching Dawn. That's, we wanted to put our language first. Yo-Yo Ma is an awesome dude. What can I say? He's one of the best human beings I've ever met in my life, to tell you the truth. And how did I end up in this situation? Well, I was head of the Abbey at the time, and he was coming to Acadia National Park, and he started something that you can actually go on his website and read about. It's called Our Common Nature. And this was the first in the experiment of that. And essentially, Yo-Yo Ma has been going through his life, performing in cities. Does not have, at this point in his life, a good relationship to nature. And he wanted to do something about that, but did not want to leave Indigenous voices out. And so when he was coming to Acadia to create, to do these pop-up performances, I was asked a question, what could Yo-Yo Ma do with music that would be meaningful to Wabanaki people? And my answer was for him to play his cello on the coast as the sun rises, because we actually have a ceremony, that is called a sunrise ceremony, that we are actually, bound. We're told to perform to help the sun rise, because we live in the land of the dawn, and we do so with music. Now, this was not an appropriation. Any of you guys can go to the coast and experience what it feels like to be one of the first people to see the sunrise. And that's what I wanted for him. But Yo-Yo Ma, being who he is, decided that I want to do this in collaboration with you all. And actually, the keys to this performance of how this was going to go was handed over to me. I had to write this performance and write Yo-Yo Ma into it. What a place. Good Lord. So that's where I ended up stuck. But it ended up a beautiful moment, and that's what we're going to be watching. I don't want to talk about it too much anymore, and then afterwards we'll have a few minutes for questions. So you're going to see my screen, which is like the horror that, nobody wants you to see the screen, but here is the film Wet'suwet'en.
وجوك منها وجيزي وجوك موجود صبنا فيه بيجا ألا يكبر لفه وشينوسيس وبينات من يوم موسوينو اللي تكسروا أجيال وبيناتوا هذا إجيكتيفوا وشكوا سكتة يوم بيناتوا نميتون وشكوا وبينات من يوم أنا وكمسو اللي بتفيدهم ويجيبون صبنا فيه وجوك من يسوس وجيزي سبيكوسة
What would be meaningful to Wabanaki people? How do we create something that will cause transformation? I said play your music at sunrise because it's part of our culture.
Indigenizing with stenosis, Korean, yellow building negum, with our vegetable for the TG twin, if they're way up, the only go TG twin all, Betty not give up on his horse, show Monsu and all. That's what TG twin to tell what well. Even stenosis, then when the Alabama is also. Either the TG twin, either God's will it well one. God's way was welcome one. And God's way see that when you look at the animal with their link, either the stenosis can go belly too. TG twin kill, then that's okay. Yes, we did keep it here, we must order. Some wood, much Antonia wood. Stenosis would TG twin, then go down a much As you get lost in ela community, that don't go to panel.
I had a really interesting idea that I would teach Yo-Yo a song, a powwow song. And he's going to accompany me. So we're going to see how this is going to go. So you ready to give it a try? All right, here we go. our ancestors have 12,000 years of welcoming the day. The meaning for me, personally, in welcoming the sun is deep. I truly am thankful for every day that I get. That I get to be a dad to my kids, and I get to raise them in a world where I hope that when I'm done here in this place, I've left it better for them. And that's what it's all about.
Itena mena kaje sakki spibu sangisus kepide dijami ki watere tiwanamio eja womon kusi eja priya tensiga dijito ni ada yang ekstino itu skopna ki dijito ni ada ali Jesus kemudian kita tahu Elmiat mena kaje Elmiat muskul Elmiat natsannya tinggi wasis Poi non erano che si volevano limitati, era uomo così che io ne scoprò qui, e poi lui che era come se si armene, e lei già studiò, ci voleva.
To be around our tribal elders, being able to learn songs, being able to just be present is beautiful. We are Wabanaki, we're still here. Our youth can see this, people that they know, taking space, holding space, unapologetically. Julie.
I feel very committed to embracing my obligation as a Pueblo woman to care for this earth and to care for the people on it. When I think about what my ancestors went through, fighting famine and drought, trying to live through colonization, holding on to the land, because that's what gives us life. We can't ever give up.
I think meaning is so elusive, and yet everybody who spoke today was filled with meaning. The fact that you can think of 7 generations back and 7 generations forward is a big lesson for us. Who can think that way? You can. The way you take care of the land, and the way you take care of one another. We can learn from that. And so your gift to us, we now have to carry forward and do.
We're all here to not just listen to people, but what follows is perhaps the most powerful thing. We have to take those things into consideration seriously. If we just leave here feeling good temporarily, then we've wasted our time. I see a lot of optimism because I see the generations that follow me. I see the next generation working their
And that is Wet'suwet'en. So at this time, I would love to open up the floor to questions. I'm not sure how much time we have. I might have went over a little bit. I'm sorry about that. But yes, I would love to answer questions for those of you that have some. Yeah.
Is that film available anywhere to view again? I'd like to see it again.
Yes, absolutely. So we made these films. They're part of something called the Reciprocity Project, which was a partnership between the Upstander Project and Neotero, and all of the Reciprocity Project films. This is actually episode 5 of 7, season 1. There's season 2 coming out very soon as well. But they're all available on Vimeo. So if you look up Wet'suwet'en on Vimeo, you're gonna find the film, the entire film. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask.
Oh, there we go.
Great. I wanted to ask you a little bit about language.
Sure.
So, and actually, Yo-Yo-Ma refers this a little bit here too. So right now, Maine is looking at the social studies standards
Yep.
for kids to be taught. And I was actually just looking at those today, this afternoon, right before I came here, and noticing like how present Wabanaki people are in these standards to a certain extent. But I'm wondering about your thoughts about incorporating language more, because right when we learn a language, we learn how to think in a new way. And so if we learn Spanish or Japanese, we think and feel in different ways. And so I wonder your thoughts on incorporating more of the native language here into the children's learning so they can learn to think in a new way.
Yeah, absolutely. So my answer to that is really, it goes along with my father's thinking. When my father was creating things or working as the engine for creating our dictionary, which has 20,000 entries, the entire thing online, we were going from a time, when everybody spoke Passamaquoddy when he was a child. And then 1970s hit, we get federal recognition, and electricity is in our homes. And all of a sudden we're having Sesame Street, and that's in the English language. And we're going to the BIA school, and English is the primary language, and our language is taught as an extracurricular. So my generation, I was born in 74, we're the first generation to grow up speaking English first. And so my father, way back in his younger days, saw the rapid, the beginnings of it, the rapid decline of fluent speakers within our own community. And so that's when he started to work on language materials with Robert Levitt and Anna Harnois and Mary Ellen Yarmel, amongst others. And, some of those things come out of the 70s. And essentially what he was doing was trying to make sure that our language would stay spoken. Even if we got to a point where a low number of people were fluent, there would be tools enough that we could get people to raise that number back up. Now, within our own community, because of how the language was taught within the household, not at school, right, he actually ran into pushback. So this is somewhat complex. Right? The idea of creating resources where anybody could speak our language. And Robert Levitt, his partner, is a non-native person, fluent in our language, a good teacher of it as well, and heads the dictionary project at the University of New Brunswick. And, so there was pushback, to my father's work. But I can say that 50 years later, the value of what he did to, to create those resources for us is invaluable. And so what I tell people is that, for our neighbors here in the state of Maine, that it's only proper that you learn some of our language to understand this land better, because the land taught us how to speak as Wabanaki people. And so therefore, if you want to get what the owner's manual sounds like, you got to learn it through our language and figure out how our language works, amongst other things, which is so different than English. English is a very noun-based language, and our language is very verb stem-based. So one of the things my dad would do, then this is where me stealing from him totally, is he would oftentimes take, he learn English first, Passamaquoddy first, and didn't learn English until 10 plus years old. So he had a habit of doing presentations like this and taking English language words and redefining them with a Passamaquoddy worldview. So the word knowledge in the English language is a noun, right? It's a thing. What is it? We could debate that all day. There's a lot of definitions for it. But what he would say is that knowledge to him, because he learned Passamaquoddy first, knowledge is actually verbal. It's actually, to him, the energy that occurs between us when we are in conversation with one another. So if you think about it, now knowledge is no longer this thing. It's an animate being within our language. And we as human beings can contribute to it. We can decimate it. We can cause knowledge to die, right? So we have a responsibility to that. And where does it happen? It happens in spaces like these where we get to talk to one another. So absolutely, I am on board with the fact that, students should be, but, have a knowledge that there's a difference between Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, there's less of a difference between Passamaquoddy and Maliseet, but Mi'kmaq, have a knowledge of that so that they don't see us as a monolith. But at the same time, definitely, I would encourage, teachers when it helps the lesson, in teaching that worldview, that the way we see the world, to use our language as much as possible. That's just how I personally feel on it. Not everybody agrees with me on that. Yes.
Yeah, I got you.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if you were aware that Yo-Yo Ma was here last month.
I was aware, yeah. No, I still work with him, to tell you the truth.
Well, my question is, you said he's an awesome dude, yeah? I felt that. When he played the Passamaquoddy piece, the Rising Sun piece at the end of the concert here in Portland. And I'm just wondering what that experience was like for you working with him, the knowledge that came between you. I'm just curious to hear more about that.
What can I say? I mean, he is as advertised, like that's one of the things. You see people on TV and they're a certain way, and then you meet them in person, it's like they're not that way. No, he is that person. He is such a humanitarian in amazing ways. And so, when it comes to the learning that happened, he was so engaged. It was ridiculous how engaged he was. And so one of the things that happened was he came, we had the rehearsal at Squiddick Point the night before, and my father was there. And so they got to meet each other. So, my father is also a really good human being in a lot of ways, and they saw that within one another. And they really connected with each other and spent the evening talking together, telling stories and laughing and just acting like they were old buddies, right? And my dad being, you saw his condition in the film and how, he was 9 years into cancer treatment at that time. And that's what it done to his body. So he was dealing with quite a lot. Yet in that moment with him and Yo-Yo Ma, I saw him as a young person. All of that sickness had gone away, right? Because my dad and him were just engaged so much. Now I had to go away from that to go do some filming for Neotero. And when I did that, the event ended with the dinner that we were having. We were staying at the main building in Squiddick Point. They actually gave my dad Deb Hallen's room So that's the respect that Yo-Yo-Ma's team gave to him. And so when they were done, my mom, who was the same age as him, was pushing him in his wheelchair across the grass to get, into the building. And Yo-Yo said, no, 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 no. Let me help you with that, and pushed my dad all the way up to his room and helped him out. Yeah, so I mean, he's a beautiful human being. What can I say? And there's so much. I mean, it changed my life to meet him. That's what I can say I can learn from him. Yes. Yeah, good question. Well, they're all at different places, and the fifth graders were pretty amazing. They even had school reporters there to report on what I was talking about. Yeah, I mean, they were really just enthralled by what they were learning about, when you like widen the lens on the Thanksgiving holiday. What happened before? What happened after? Why was the Patuxet village abandoned? It's because of the Great Dying. They were learning and absorbing these things, right? And even though some of the histories once again are hard, what happened after the Mayflower landing, was not so good. They all understood that it's not their fault, but they had a better understanding of their world around them. And I saw all of them so excited about that, that a world with Native people in it that contribute. Gerald Visner is an Ojibwe scholar that coined the term survivance, which is more than survival. It's about having a presence. And Native people in this country, we embrace that term survivance, that it's not just about being here, it's also about having a presence within this place. I mean, just the kids were amazing, to the point where, like they see an author and stuff like that, they wanted autographs and things like that, but they were really interested in the history that they learned. And they had so many questions. I couldn't answer them all. I just did not have the time. Yes, sir.
So, these things scare me. But no, one of the things that I'm new to Maine. You might tell from my accent. But what can we do? I mean, what can your average person who's non-native do to really help indigenize our culture, our society?
Well, I mean, we can't indigenize Maine culture so much because the indigenous culture is our culture, right? But one of the things you hear my dad say it, at the end of the film, and this is a challenge that I would give to everybody in this room, right? That what goes on past here is what really matters. That if you were to just come to this presentation to feel good temporarily, then you are wasting your time. And so therefore, take this knowledge, take the understanding that we can teach hard histories to children. They can absorb it and they can get excited about a world that they live in that is more inclusive of a lot of stories that they haven't heard. And, to go forward and to promote that, to be in support of it. In our school system, public school system has been part of that erasure. They've been teaching the first Thanksgiving narrative about pilgrims and Indians, in a friendly, good time story, when there's more to it than that since the 1850s. And so, we got a lot of undoing to do, So the conversations, what I tell people is about my education is that I went to the school of Wayne Newell. That's where my degree comes from. The conversations that we had at the kitchen table at my house, I could have never got in a college classroom. And I would encourage you, the kitchen table conversations you have within your own families, to talk about these things. Not with the idea of, once again, blaming, but the idea of saying, okay, let's learn from this, and what can we do as human beings going forward for the next generations to do better? Yes, sir.
In trying to get our heads around the change in understanding of the indigenous people's culture, and have the conversations about the genocide. I guess I think it's important to first understand the culture, the sort of the organization of the tribes, the communities,
Yep.
the family units, to sort of be able to explain that the parents loved their children, and there was an organization, and I think it's important to undemonize the natives, because otherwise, you're always going to have that in the back of your head. We certainly were indoctrinated with that, and so I'm working on some projects that we will be approaching genocide, but first I think we need resources to understand they weren't that different from us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and one of the things that we teach at Akomawt Educational Initiative in our pedagogy is when you teach these histories, start in the present. What that does is it fights the implicit bias that we're all dead and gone, because sadly there are probably students in your room that think that. And so if you start in the present with the native tribes of today and how we exist today, then you fight that bias, and then you can start to talk about how we got to the point where we are now. Why do Native people live on small reservations, right, where the rest of us get, the chance to own land anywhere? What is the difference between, communal land ownership that happens on the reservations versus private land ownership that happens off of the reservations, right? There is two different lifestyles that are actively going on in the present right now. And if you can make kids aware of that, then that can open their mind up to, the history that and do what you're talking about, not demonize, but to humanize our ancestors. So yeah, very good question. Thank you. All right, I think I wore you guys out. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. Eric's on his way up here to probably give you a goodbye, but I just want to express my sincere thanks to all of you. Jiwiliwan naga apchuch numiopa. We don't say goodbye in our language. We say thank you, and we also say, well, I'll see you again. So I hope to see you again sometime in the future. Thank you all so much.
Will you please join me in saying Wuliwan to Chris Newell for being with us?
All right, perfect.
Thank you all. Just a reminder, Chris will be signing books in the gallery, and you are welcome to go either through that front door or around through the lobby if you'd like to either purchase, if you lived at the time of the Plymouth Thanksgiving, or to look at the Our Town exhibit in the Meetinghouse Arts Gallery. Thank you so much. Be sure to sign up for our mailing list or check out some of the upcoming events that are posted in the lobby. Have a great evening. Thank you. Thank you, guys.